Okay, so now that we know how to solve, and we figured out, or we learned 3 different methods for solving quadratic equation, let's go ahead and summarize this. And the first one we learned was called the zero factor rule, or property or principle. That basically said if you have factor times a factor equals 0, then the first factor equals 0, or the second factor equals 0. If you have more factors, that would equal 0. And I tell students to always try this first. Always see if you can use zero factor rule. If it doesn't factor, if you set equal to 0, but other side doesn't factor, then choose another method. Okay, the second method we learned was the square root property. And we saw that if something squared equals a constant, then we know that that something is equal to plus or minus the square root of that constant. Okay. I always try this if missing middle term, or special case. Third one's called complete the square. We did not cover this, so you won't be responsible for that. The last method is called the quadratic formula. If ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, so your quadratic equation in general form, then x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, and I always try this if cannot use zero factor rule or square root property. My last resort. Because if you're using the quadratic formula and it's easily the zero factor rule is easily used, or the square root property is, the quadratic formula actually becomes a little more complicated in terms of finding the answer. It's not particularly wrong, but it's going to be easier to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have you go into your textbook, and then I know you don't have textbooks, so you can go in your textbook through your multimedia library. So if you go into your shell, I'm going to multimedia library, and you're going to find chapter 1, section 1.5, and we're going to the textbook. Go into that section. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a bunch of problems, and we're going to look at them, and we're going to look at what would happen if you had a choice. If I said just solve this second degree equation and tell me which method you would use, or what would be the easiest method to use. So I'm going to go to page, one of the further pages in this section. This one's actually helpful to have a book, but I think it is the last page of the section. Okay, so here I want to go through problems 83 through say 103 right here. These problems right here. Now this friend right here, what I would do is if I were given this problem on the test, the first thing I would do is look at this, and I would look at it and say, well, I'm going to try the zero factor rule. For number 83, I would go look at 2x squared minus x equals 1. I would set that equal to 0, and then I would use the zero factor rule. Now if it doesn't factor on the left-hand side, what I would do is I would go ahead and then use the quadratic formula. Okay, I could not use the square root property here because there's a middle term, there's an x term there. Okay. Problem 85, the same idea. Here I would set one side equals 0, so I would have 5x squared minus 11x plus 2 equals 0, and then I would do the zero factor rule. If it doesn't factor, then I would use the quadratic formula. Number 87, if I look at this carefully, notice how 87 doesn't have a middle term. If I went ahead and looked at it, I have an x squared, but I have no x term. So I have a constant there, but I have no x term. What I would do at this point is I would actually use the square root property. Okay? You can do the zero factor, but I would try that first, but I would definitely use the square root property, one of my choices there. Number 89, I would set equal to 0, I would use the zero factor rule. And then if that didn't work, I would use the quadratic formula. Number 91, I would go ahead and multiply all this out, then set one I think equal to 0. And then I would go ahead and use the zero factor rule. If that didn't work, I'd use the quadratic formula. Number 93, now look at 93 carefully. 93 is one where it's a special case. You could use the square root property of something squared equals a number. That would be the square root property, special case. 95, I would do the zero factor rule. And if that didn't work, I'd use the quadratic formula. Number 97, square root property, because there's no middle term. Okay, so go ahead and get the x squared term alone and use the square root property. Number 99, I'd use the zero factor rule. If that didn't work, quadratic formula. Number 101, I would use the zero factor rule, and then the quadratic formula if that didn't work. And in 103, I would use the zero factor rule. If that didn't work, the quadratic formula. So a lot of these, it would be either the zero factor rule, and then the quadratic formula, or the square root property. Okay, so just kind of look through all those. And when you get your homework, when it says by the method of your choice, I want you to choose the most efficient method. And what we just did there, we go through the most efficient method. Okay, so again, on the test, I would ask you specifically to solve by a particular method. So there's some problems I'll say, solve this using the quadratic formula. Or I'll say, solve this using the zero factor rule. Or solve this using the square property. That would tell you which method to use. But if I give you a choice, you want to determine the most efficient method to use, and you go back to this chart here, and you look at some of the clues I gave you right here on when I would use a specific method. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at example, next example, page 44. Solve the following equation by the method of your choice. This is one where I would use the zero factor rule. And if that didn't work, then I would use the quadratic formula. No way would I ever use the square root property here, because if I go to multiply this all out, I'll get another term. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply this all out. The reason I don't use zero factor right away, some people say this is factored, and then I can just say that equals 0, but there's no 0 here. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go ahead and set one side equal to 0 right away. By doing that, I would have minus 1 right here. I have to subtract 1 from both sides. And now I have to go ahead and unscramble all this on this side and come up with a new polynomial. We're going to have 2x squared plus 8x plus 3x plus 12. Then drop down the minus 1 equals 0. So 2x squared plus 11x plus 11 equals 0. And now I'm going to go ahead and factor the left-hand side. I'm going to try the zero factor rule. I get 22 on top, and I get 11 on the bottom. 1 times 22. And it looks like there's not a way to factor this. So it doesn't factor. So I'm going to go ahead and try the quadratic formula now. So I'm going to say a equals 2, b equals 11, and c equals 11. So x is going to equal negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 11 squared minus 4 times 2 times 11 all over 2 times 2. Okay, so I'm going to pull up my calculator. And 11 squared minus 4 times 2 times 11. Again, I'm typing in my calculator, but please go ahead and type it in your calculator too so you get practice doing this. You don't want to wait till the exam and you're like, I don't know how to type this in my calculator. So you should get 33 under the radicals. I get equals negative 11 plus or minus square root of 33 all over 4. And you can write that also as negative 11 over 4 plus or minus square root of 33 over 4. This does not reduce at all. So there's my answer. That's what it is. Okay. But you see, if I could have factored this left-hand side right here, then I would have had 2 factors, that equals 0, and then I would have done the 0 factor rule. But it did not factor. That's why I use the quadratic formula. Okay. So the next example, I'm going to go ahead and look at this, and I say, well, there's no term there, so I'm going to go ahead and use the 0 factor rule or the quadratic formula. Once that equals 0, so I get 3x squared minus 4x minus 4 equals 0. So I've subtracted 4 from both sides. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and factor the left-hand side. I tried to. So I get negative 12. I get negative 4. 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4. So it looks like I'm going to use the 2 and 6. So I go ahead and make the 6 negative, and that works. So 2 times negative 6 is 12. And 2 plus negative is negative 4. So I'm going to factor this left-hand side. And I'm going to go ahead and finish that up. So I get x, I get 3x plus 2 minus 2, 3x plus 2. So having 2 factors are 3x plus 2 and x minus 2 equals 0. So if I go ahead and set each factor equals 0, I get x equals negative 2/3. And I add 2 to both sides here, I get x equals 2. So I get 2 solutions. If you had done the quadratic formula on this one, it'd be a little bit harder to get the fractional values. I mean, you can get them, it's just a little bit harder, much easier to get this using the 0 factor rule. This is the one I use the 0 factor rule. If it had not factored, if this had not worked, then I would have done the quadratic formula. Okay. And then the last example I have 2x squared equals 250. So I go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and look at this carefully, and I notice that there's no middle term, there's no x term. So I'm going to use the square root property. The most efficient method in this case. So I have now, I divide by 2 on both sides. I get x squared equals 125. But now I say x equals plus or minus square root of 125. And the square root of 125 breaks down into square root of 25 times 5, which is 5 square root 5. Like an x equals plus or minus 5 square root 5. This is much quicker to get the answer this way than to use the quadratic formula. And the 0 factor rule would not give you the answer. Now let's go over page 161 and go over which method is most efficient. We just did that a minute ago. So if you have any questions, go back to that page and I showed you how to get there and find out which is the most efficient method from 83 to 103 odd. I verbally said all those, but if you have any questions or you need to email me, you can email me and ask me which problem, which message I use. Okay? Okay, let's go ahead, and there's actually some real-life applications using quadratic equations, but I'm getting close to the end of my 15 minutes, so we'll go ahead and stop this video, and in the last part we'll finish up this section.